Draw.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Hancock, final furlong. We had almost finished with excess PPE. We dealt with pricing. I just want to finish up with the amounts or the quantity of excess.
Yeah.
It might be convenient just to turn up a document so that gives us a sense of that. This was drawn to the attention of Mr. Marin at the beginning of his evidence, but I'll draw it also to your attention. I hope we can agree figures from it. It's a DHSC document, INQ 000534966. It's a document produced by Peter Howard and sent to Jonathan Marin. And what we see, if we scroll down a bit, please, and a bit further. That's it. Table 1, snapshot of volume and value of excess stock from the 7th of June 2021 with high assumptions for demand. This is by items in billions.
Yeah.
It results in an excess stock amount of 6.9, but we need to reduce that down, and we'll look at the paragraphs that follow in order to do that.
Could you just tell me the date of this note?
Yes. If we turn to the top of it, I hope it's got that date on it. I think it's towards the end that it's 28th of July 2021.
So I obviously haven't seen this because I wasn't Secretary of State at that point. So this will have been a note to Secretary of State Sajid Javid.
Yes, you may not have seen it at the time. I think you've seen it in advance of today's hearing, have you not?
Impossible to remember.
All right. Well, I don't think that's a critical point for these purposes.
No, but the point that matters is that SOS there is Secretary of State, but that's not me. That's
yes, different individual.
Yeah.
But what we have here is a snapshot of what the excess PPE position was.
Yes.
At this date.
Yes, large. Yes.
It's very large.
Yeah, enormous. Yeah.
It's enormous, and you said earlier that it was larger than you would have certainly hoped, that you would have expected. I pressed you to see whether you could give any indication of by how much. I think that was a difficult exercise for you to conduct. And I appreciate that there were many, many variables in play at the time, weren't there? Whether a vaccine would become available.
Yeah, you see, exactly. So the thing is that these figures obviously are the best estimate at the time, but they're also unknowable. If the pandemic had carried on for another year, then we would have used 6.9 more billion items. If it had ended sooner, the stockpile would have been even greater. You know, so it's a very hard thing to judge. As it happens, once Paul Dighton was brought in, then those judgments ultimately on purchase were for him. So I wasn't particularly close to it at this stage, and this note is about what then to do with it. But it is obviously that's a very large number, and I would have hoped most of that is laid down in storage for next time.
And it's put into pounds, shillings, and pence at paragraph 3 beneath it. The PPE network in the UK is currently storing 1.3 million pallets of PPE. This costs the department in the region of 300 million per year in operational costs, mainly storage. At current pandemic usage, we estimate that £3.8 billion of stock will expire before it can be used. So there's a deduction there because some of it will achieve beneficial use within its lifespan.
Well, who knows? Because we don't know when the next pandemic's going to strike. My point isn't to be defensive on this, it's that these figures are the best estimate. Working out how much PPE you should stock is difficult. You don't know how long a pandemic's going to go on for when you're responding to one. Obviously, it's self-evident and sort of banal to say that you want to buy the right amount of PPE, but nobody's going to, in practice, get that exactly right. We clearly we as a nation bought more than was necessary. The July 2021 estimate of that is here. The learning is try to buy the right amount. Well, sure.
Well, the only reason for the point I raised, and I don't want to labour it, is that even absent a pandemic, there is a degree of use of PPE.
Sure, yeah.
So that
on the run, yeah.
And that's the basis upon which these figures are reduced down.
As best you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's just have a look, as best we can, at how the UK compared in terms of its over-procurement with other countries. Could we have INQ 000474994? And we've got a couple of graphs here provided to us by UK ACC, who have given evidence within this module. You'll note at the outset that this doesn't relate only to PPE, but it's total cumulative COVID contract awards, here initially awarded in direct and negotiated procedures without publication. And you can see that on this chart, the UK is a significant outlier compared to other countries, Germany, France and Poland.
This, in my understanding, having not seen this chart before, my understanding from the words in the title is that this is entirely meaningless because we have a national publicly owned single purchaser health system, whereas Germany, France, and is that Poland? I don't know much about the Polish health system, but I know a lot about the French and the German, and they don't. So it's a meaningless chart.
All right, let's, well, just for completeness, I hear that evidence. The chart below it relates, you've got the sums involved down the x-axis, cumulative value.
Yes.
You'd say equally meaningless.
Yeah, because in a privately run system, even if it's got nationally required insurance, like the French system, what's directly procured by central government is different. It's just the chart might as well be stating that there are two different types of health system and that we're the only one out of all these to have an NHS. That's what it tells you. Other than that, there is no factual value in this chart.
All right, Mr. Hancock, I want to now ask you, you've been asked about ministerial pressure. I also want to ask you about the pressure that was placed on ministers.
Okay.
Such as you, by others.
Right, yeah.
And there was no shortage of that, presumably.
By others and by circumstances, yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of those others, without levelling any criticism at her, was Dame Donna Kinnair, who placed you under a degree of pressure when she contacted you directly about gown shortages.
For context, she was the head of the Royal College of Nursing, so it was entirely appropriate that we should be in contact. And what would you have done?
I didn't suggest otherwise, and it's not my role to answer questions today. This is presumably someone you would have wanted to maintain a good relationship with.
Yes, that was very important.
Of course. You were very concerned about frontline workers and knew that they were at risk every day working on the front line.
That's correct.
Yeah.
As was she.
As was she. She represented their interests quite directly, didn't she?
She did, yes.
Yeah. You were probably aware at this sensitive time that a negative interaction with Dame Donna Kinnair might have political repercussions and might risk losing the trust of nursing staff, which would have been a problem.
Yes, I'm not sure political is the right word, because it wasn't about, none of this was about party politics. That was irrelevant. But I was in negotiations directly or indirectly with Donna Kinnair on a whole series of different subjects at any one time. For instance, you know, the ratio of nurses who might be looking after people in intensive care, the rules around protective equipment and what people should be wearing. So it was a very important relationship to maintain.
Yeah. We know, perhaps let's have it on the screen, a display INQ 000536369. I think this is an excerpt from your, yes, Chris Hall's evidence. I was contacted again, says Chris Hall, by Matt Hancock on the 16th of April. He expressed concern that Donna Kinnair would go to the press with criticism of the way in which his department was procuring PPE and asked why we were not able to proceed. So that presumably is an illustration of the sort of pressure you were experiencing as a result of this intervention from Donna Kinnair.
Yes, I don't think that Donna Kinnair, I can't recall Donna Kinnair ever having directly threatened me that she would go to the press, but she was in the news a lot, and there was a lot of there were a lot of questions being raised about PPE supply. But this is a reasonable description of the dynamics that we were living in.
Let's display INQ 000551316, please. And this is an exchange of messages between yourself. I think you're the owner of the cell phone in this exchange.
Yeah.
Donna Kinnair, to you. Are we going to need to talk about what we do about the shortages of gowns coming over the horizon? And then why can't we use waterproof tablecloths and other suggestions that she makes?
And recycling gowns that are intact.
And recycling gowns that are intact, exactly. Also, if this 96-hour quarantine, you respond, yes, that's a very good argument. We're looking at all options. Very important to keep the front line on side and supported, you say.
Yes.
To which she apparently interprets as a point of PR. She says, this isn't a PR job. We are on side. We are going to work. I am volunteering.
Yeah.
But already this morning, leaders are telling those requiring PPE yesterday to forget it today. I'm very concerned.
Yeah.
And then she mentions to you the possibility of a supplier, George Farha, whom she describes as one of your party donators, and my friend can get FDA-approved gowns here by Wednesday.
Yeah.
And he knows how many you want. To cut a long story short, you helped to take that forward, did you not?
Yes, you'll see it in the, no doubt. It'll all be written in the messages. What I expect and what I can recollect happened is I said, please send in the proposal, and I then sent it on to the team. That's what I generally did. It
resulted in a contract for 10,000 gowns, did it not?
I subsequently discovered that. I didn't know about that at the time.
There were other offers made by Mr. Farha. And they are, can we have INQ 000551372, please? This is Chris Hall, I think. To you, I'm sorry, but I've some disappointing news on this deal. So this was a separate deal, not the 10,000 gowns, but something else that Mr. Farha was offering as introduced by Dame Donna Kinnair.
Okay.
I have some disappointing news on this deal. We worked intensively with George and his colleagues over 5 days and so on. The deal would have involved £6 million being at risk at any one time through a company with very little capitalisation, while George offered bank guarantees of up to £0.5 million at the last moment. This was not enough to convince DHSC colleagues that it was an acceptable risk. We'll keep exploring options and so on. In the end, this set of exchanges, took up quite a lot of time, including your time, resulting in a relatively small number of gowns, didn't it?
Well, there were many. As we've been through this before, there's proposals that worked well and there's proposals that didn't. And what you can see in front of us is my response, which is entirely appropriate. Thanks for letting me know. It's not like there's no pressure applied to Chris Hall to do anything about it. It's entirely proper, and no doubt, having read all of my correspondence, you'll know that was exactly how I treated all of these proposals that came to me.
Mr. Hancock, I must urge you to be a little bit less defensive. No one has accused you in this email string of impropriety. All right?
Carry on then.
What I want to know from you, we touched on it before lunch. You were devising methods of improving the system, and we started to explore the possibility within a parliamentary democracy of controlling or moderating the input that some may regard as inevitable, either from ministers or from individuals such as Dame Donna Kinnair, to find out what's going on, to recommend suppliers of urgently needed gowns. Now, first of all, do you think that type of intervention is ever problematic, was problematic on this occasion?
I'm not quite sure what you're getting at. If you're going to have to ask a better question.
Well, thank you for your comment. Did you welcome Dame Donna Kinnair's intervention?
I welcomed the proposal of more PPE, and I sent it into the system. It also had the characteristics of a response that I needed to maintain was properly looked at. Even if the result of it was not successful, it needed It needed proper handling. It's a really good example of why it would be naive to suggest that ministers shouldn't be involved in this. Notwithstanding the constitutional point, it happens in these sorts of circumstances.
Now, Mr. Hancock, you said again before the short adjournment that you were concerned, to put it lightly, at the welfare of those who were actively engaged in emergency procurement.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the ways of protecting them, of safeguarding them, is to provide as much transparency as is possible about offers that come in to their attention. Would you agree with that?
I don't know. Depends on the circumstances.
So last week, Mr. Gove was taken to a number of emails in which he was described as a friend of Mr. Mellor.
Right.
He said that the reference to his friendship was a way of signalling to others that the offer should be treated scrupulously, should be treated without offering any favours to Mr. Mellor.
Right.
There are alternative methods of dealing with an association or a friendship such as that, such as declaring the association,
right,
but adding a caveat that no preferential treatment should be given.
Yes, the thing is, I saw that exchange, and again, I'm sorry to keep having to come back to this. The circumstances at the time were of a shortage of PPE, enormous numbers of people dying, and a huge amount of pressure. So when I was responding to that email or those messages, I'll have been dealing with 100 such messages at the same time. And so I saw this implication that, an appropriate and proper disclaimer should be put on every email. It's just not what happens in the real world. And so the naivety of the questioning is a bit of a problem.
Mr. Hancock, let's focus on your evidence. I want your view.
You asked me about his evidence, so forgive me for answering.
Whether you agree that repeated references to a friendship are a sufficient method of signalling to those others involved with triage and processing an offer that no favouritism should be offered.
I think that it's absolutely reasonable, but not the only way of dealing with it.
What are the other ways of dealing with it?
Well, making sure that whenever you send on a proposal and it's rejected, that your response is no problem. Making clear that your sole objective is to procure more PPE wherever it's necessary. There's lots of different ways of doing it. You could do it within the triage system. That's one of the reasons that we had the triage system, that we had a triage system, so that people like Chris Hall could say, I can't recommend this, and then it wasn't recommended. In fact, there's a benefit to that, which is that I could then go back and say, I'm terribly sorry, this isn't going to work, because it hasn't got through the gateway. So there's lots of different ways you can deal with it.
You deal in your witness evidence with Hinpack and Alpha Laboratories.
I do.
You do. You were first contacted by Alex Bourne by WhatsApp on the 30th of March 2020, weren't you? Sorry, not first. In relation to this.
Yeah.
Presumably you had been contacted previously. He had your number.
He had my number because he was a constituent. So as you mentioned at the start of this session, I had two roles. One as the MP for West Suffolk, the other as Secretary of State.
Was that the extent of your relationship with him?
Essentially, yes. I'd been to a constituency event with him beforehand.
Not a friend?
I didn't know him before he became a constituent, and he had my mobile number because many constituents did. Was he also your pub landlord? He had run a pub in the village which I'd opened, but he's not my pub landlord, and he also ran a plastics factory, which is an entirely reasonable enterprise. Previously, he had served with distinction as a soldier in the UK Army. He's a man of high integrity.
Can I just have up on the screen INQ 000 551 393, please? He contacted you on the 14th of May as he had approval to make test tubes for antigen tests.
Right.
He was also hoping to get sign-off to produce saliva test kits to be assembled, and that is why he contacted you. You passed on his communication to Lord Bethell, didn't you?
Well, that's what this shows. Yeah.
And we've heard evidence to that effect earlier today from Lord Bethell himself. You say of Alex Bourne, I think this is a very interesting critique from someone who turned his business to testing when the crisis broke. He's a very impressive guy and quite a good analysis, to which you're referring to the analysis that he gives below in the email chain there.
Yes.
Again, this is a neutral question, Mr. Hancock. Would it have been helpful or necessary or protective of others for you to have described your relationship with Mr. Bourne, or do you think that that was unnecessary in this context?
Totally unnecessary, given the context, and it was what mattered was, in this case, seeing whether this analysis that he put forward was reasonable.
Can we just finish up? INQ 000 551 404. Again, this is an exchange. You are the owner of the cell phone. It says, yes, I'm taking not forward this end. That must be a typo. I assume from the response that you get from Alex Bourne that you are signalling here to him that you will be taking his proposal forward. Is that right?
Well, actually, what this shows you is the speed at which all of this was done. You know, this the argument you imply that there should be a full legal disclaimer put on all communications is for the birds. I'm acting at high speed to respond to hundreds of messages. You've picked out a couple. You've chosen the ones that have most tabloid interest, which is, frankly, disappointing, but inevitable, I suppose. And what you can see in all of the communications around this is my impeccable behaviour in terms of taking forward this proposal from somebody who was both a constituent and somebody trying to help in the national effort. It is a shame that you continue to impugn the integrity of those involved, especially Mr. Bourne, who lent in when the crisis came.
Can I bring you back to my question, please?
I answered it, yeah.
I don't believe you did. The question was, does your message contain a typographical error?
I've no idea. I can't remember sending the message. I will have been sending hundreds at the same time.
Did you take Mr. Bourne's offer forward or not?
I've absolutely no idea. You can see the paperwork if you've read it.
All right. Mr. Hancock, thank you very much. My lady, no more questions for this witness.
Right. Just a few more questions. Mr. Hancock, Ms. Morris.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Hancock, I ask questions on behalf of the COVID bereaved Families for Justice, as you know. I've got two topics to ask you questions about, please. The first, Joanna Churchill, a junior minister within the DHSC, has recalled in her written statement that there was what she described a tussle between the DHSC and the Cabinet Office at the outset of the pandemic as to who would be responsible for procurement. And specifically, she says in her statement that she said there were occasions where I felt individuals were playing politics and there were lots of big personalities in the room during COBRA meetings rather than a complete focus. And she said, in my view, there was a lack of clarity as to who was in charge between the Secretaries of State in DHSC and the Cabinet Office. There was a lack of understanding of how the NHS worked in practical terms by the majority of those in COBRA. So my question is, did a lack of clarity as to who was in charge between the DHSC and the Cabinet Office delay action to procure PPE between February and March of 2020?
Oh, no. We put out I put out the call to get going procuring PPE in January 2020, and that's what we did. There were some areas where procurement was moved, for instance, on ventilators. The Prime Minister did that in order to essentially take some of the huge burden off the department. But I thought there was perfect clarity on that. Some people around a COBRA table may not have understood the distinction between what NHS England does and what the department does, and that would be an entirely reasonable reflection. And in terms of what in practice is done by the Cabinet Office and what in practice is done by the department. Remember, the department was not a big procuring department before the crisis. That was one of the things we had to invent, as I discussed in the previous questions.
So do you accept her observation about being a tussle at the outset?
It's not how I experienced it, but she may have been. She may have seen things that I didn't.
Moving on to later on in March of 2020, at that stage, were you still providing assurances that PPE supply was under control, that you had about 10 weeks' supply left in stock? And if so, on what basis were you making those assurances?
Well, I was given some advice at that time saying that there was, which matches that description. But as you know, I had been working on PPE supply from January 2020. I think the question you're getting at comes from the evidence of Mr. Cummings, but we've already seen that that is not reliable evidence.
Well, the Chair has got evidence before her from Module 2 from Mr. Cummings. What my question is really getting at is, did you attempt to downplay PPE shortages in supply in March 2020?
Absolutely not. On the contrary, I was raising the concerns with the appropriate people. So, for instance, one of the things we've discussed is the need to change the Treasury rules in terms of the price at which you could buy. So I raised that at the Cabinet table, and the Chancellor changed the rules. With respect to Mr. Cummings, of course, I had experienced already by then, and it got much worse, some of the very difficult problems that he caused in intervening in some ways in a totally inappropriate manner.
Hancock, and I don't need to trouble you with your view on Mr. Cummings.
No,
it's really about whether you were downplaying anything or creating a comms package, I think is the word we've seen from other emails, about the state of PPE at the end of March 2020.
No. I was answering the question, actually, because in that particular concern, I was concerned to ensure that particular individual, because of his malign influence, was not heavily engaged in the subject area.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
That's very kind. Thank you, Ms Morris. Who's next? Mr Thomas.
Good afternoon, Mr Hancock.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. Mr Hancock, you know that I represent FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Workers. I've only got one topic to discuss with you this afternoon, and I'll be quick. When we've previously met at this inquiry, you've previously acknowledged the existence of and your awareness of institutional racism within the NHS.
Yes.
So here's the question. Reflecting on PPE procurement and the management of the PIP stockpile during the pandemic, in the light of the previous knowledge and acknowledgement of institutional racism, question, can you help the inquiry with this? What key lessons were learned regarding ensuring equitable access to suitable PPE for all healthcare workers, and more specifically, how were the strategies and actions tailored to address the differential needs and challenges faced by ethnic minority healthcare workers? Could you help us with that, please?
Yes, it's an incredibly important question, and I think that it is. It would have been far better if it had been properly addressed before the pandemic, because we did find that the stockpile did not include nearly enough PPE that specifically could be fit tested to non-white features, if you will forgive me for phrasing it that way, and in particular those from a black ethnic group. This was true, for instance, with face masks. I remember going on a visit to a fit test unit and seeing for myself the pure and straightforward physical differences that need to be taken into account. They were not taken into account enough in the stockpile that we inherited, and that must be addressed.
That's very helpful, Mr. Hancock. I want to be forward-looking to assist the inquiry. I know you're not Health Secretary now, but having been in that role, what advice would you say to deal with this in the future?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to recognise that the proportion of people who work in the NHS and in social care who are from ethnic minority backgrounds is much higher than in the population as a whole. The service given in those two professions is incredible from people either who didn't, wherever they were born. The proportion who have ethnic minority backgrounds are much higher, and that was not reflected in the stockpile. So the future PPE stockpile must be appropriate for the workforce that it is primarily intended for.
Thank you, Mr. Hancock. Malika, those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Stanton. Stanton's right over there.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Mr. Hancock.
Good afternoon.
I ask questions on behalf of the British Medical Association.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to ask you about PPE supply and demand modelling, please.
Okay.
And to refer you to a document which I hope you'll have some familiarity with, authored by McKinsey and Company, together with DHSC colleagues. It's dated the 29th of March, and the reference is INQ 000 339131, page 3. And I hope you have that before you.
Yeah.
And on the top line, you'll see it deals with the issue of FFP3 respirator shortages.
Yeah.
Second column makes a couple of observations about how demand will burn down existing stock, and also that forecasted supply would be inconsequential against demand. And then in the final column under actions, it suggests 3 options, or increase acquisition, reduce demand with policy, and approve FFP2 masks as a substitute. And it's the second bullet that I'd like to particularly refer you to, the reduction of demand through policy. I'd like to ask, please, whether you were aware of this proposal to manage the demand for FFP3 masks through policy, and whether you could provide any insight into how this reduction in demand was achieved.
I'm afraid I don't recollect anything in this space. I mean, it is obviously what is written there is obvious, and you have to deal with the art of the possible when you're in a pandemic, as your members will know. But I have no recollection, and I wouldn't really have been involved at this level of detail.
Given what you've said around your priority to save lives, which is entirely accepted by the British Medical Association, would the fact that demand management of this nature was taking place caused you any concerns, or becoming aware of it now cause you concern?
Well, obviously, action 1 is the best, isn't it? I mean, you don't want to have to move people down from FFP3 to FFP2 if you can avoid it. You don't want to constrain demand by reducing the recommendations in terms of usage, for instance, by saying that masks should be used for a longer period than previously. Mm-hmm. You don't want to do that, but you could. But it may, if acquisition improvement is not possible, then the second and third bullets may be better than running out. But nobody would want to do that.
Thank you. One final question. On a different topic. You explain at paragraph 217 why the UK did not join the EU procurement programme for ventilators. There was some issue with emails having been sent to the wrong email address, but actually ultimately your conclusion was that the UK programme was better and more effective. Can I ask you, though, whether any consideration was given to joining the EU procurement programme for PPE?
Yes.
And why that wasn't done?
Well, I was entirely pragmatic on this question, and we, in the end, didn't join these procurement schemes because they would have, because we thought that we could procure quicker ourselves because of the mutualisation of supplies. And we were, remember, for all the problems, we were in a better position than many of our EU counterparts much of this time. So we made a judgment on that basis. There was the problem with ventilators when the EU sent the invitation to the wrong email address. We also looked, for instance, at joining the procurement with for vaccines with the EU, and I'm very glad that we didn't, because their procurement was slower than ours, and we would have had to give up our supplies into their system in order to be able to access it. So I was entirely pragmatic on this question.
Sorry, could I ask, what do you mean by mutualisation of supplies?
There was part of any agreement was about making sure that the supplies that were bought in were then spread equally across the different participants in the schemes, as opposed to going to who bought them. And we felt that our firepower was more was stronger than the average EU position would have been.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hancock. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Right, I think we have. Is it? No, it's Ms. Parsons.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Mr. Hancock. I asked questions on behalf of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. My questions are on just one topic, and that is pandemic stockpiles. I want to ask you about a meeting that you had on the 11th of February 2020, so at the start of the pandemic, with Steve Oldfield, the department's chief commercial officer. It's described in your witness statement at paragraph 60, so that's page 13, the witness statement, INQ 000 536 350. I'll just read it out. It forms the basis of the questions that follow. At the meeting, Steve commented that the devolved administrations had asked to access PHE's stockpiles, which were for England. I commented that the stockpiles should be open to the devolved administrations, but that we should ask them to also plan to stockpile. While not a formal responsibility of the UK government in normal times, I was very concerned to ensure adequate supplies across the whole UK, despite lower stockpiles in the devolved nations. Firstly, is it right, Mr. Hancock, that Wales had its own stockpile and it was the Welsh government that was responsible for that stockpile?
Yes, that was entirely reasonable, given that the NHS is run by the Welsh government in Cardiff.
And we know that there were shortages across all 4 nations of PPE. Are you able to help with why it was necessary for the Welsh government to ask for access to England's stockpiles? Well,
because there's a whole series of different things that add up to PPE as a group description, you know, gloves, masks, gowns. And one country within the UK may have been short of one at one point, and another be able to help. And as the 4 health ministers worked well together, and we helped each other out in this way. So just because the formal delineation of responsibility for the NHS in Wales fell to Cardiff, doesn't mean that if they were short of masks in Wrexham Hospital and we had some spare ones in Chester, we wouldn't send them down the A534. I mean, that's how it's another example of how we work together to try to mitigate the enormous challenges that we faced.
And were you aware of any particular problems faced by the Welsh government in respect of its stockpiles?
Yeah, they were short as well. We all had the same problem.
Thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Hancock.
Thank you very much, Ms. Parsons. Now it's Ms. Mitchell. That way.
I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. I'd like first to ask you about PPE supply. A document, I don't need it to be brought up, but for the purposes of the inquiry, the references INQ 000 551 263. This document notes that in relation to PPE supply, that consistent, proactive and clear communication with stakeholders, including devolved administrations, have been vital to the success of the continuity of the supply programme. When reading the documents that have come into the inquiry and have been disclosed to court participants, there have been a number of instances where it's been said, against that background, that because the UK government and devolved governments and different bodies may have all been bidding for PPE, that they may have been cannibalising their own supply in that process. Given that there are a number of bodies that can buy PPE, do you think it would be better to try and streamline the process rather than relying on communication methods between all the buyers?
No, it absolutely would not be better to narrow down who could buy PPE by doing it centrally. It was far better to have many buyers in the global market. I don't accept that there was any cannibalisation. Many hospital trusts went out and bought PPE directly for themselves. It's totally understandable that the devolved did as well. If you had Jean Freeman sitting here and you told her that she had to buy through the UK system, she would have given you short shrift because she was responsible for the NHS in Scotland and wanted to get PPE. So we collaborated, as described in the answers to the previous questions, but it was absolutely right that everybody went out and bought. Lots of people went out and bought on behalf of the nation. The idea of centralisation, which would require cutting off some options of supply, I think would be a mistake.
Yeah, I perhaps didn't, in my question, mean you to consider that I was saying that there should be one purchaser.
Okay.
Simply asked whether or not streamlining a process would be helpful, and if so, what that might look like.
Oh, well, as per the discussions about in the main evidence session, of course it can be streamlined. Of course you can use better data. Absolutely, you should. But that wasn't the reality that we faced at that moment.
Well, this takes me neatly right on to my next question, which is about the issue of data.
Yeah.
I note that when you gave evidence, you explained that all the data at the early stages would be good as much as possible, and you said, and knowing the progress of any particular offer is updated accurately in the system, so someone could just go into it and say, well, this is where we're up to. In relation to independent sourcing, do you think it would make sense in the future to have a centralised system of data? Now, this question I am asking about centralisation. A centralised data system to show if and when different PPE buying bodies, Scotland, the UK government, individual NHS trusts, are pursuing their own sourcing to avoid conflict with other buyers.
Intelligent use of data is at the centre of any high-performing system, increasingly so in the modern world. And so centralising data exchange whilst decentralising activity, including, for instance, procurement activity, is, in principle, usually the best approach. You know, it's certainly the best approach, I think, to fixing the NHS now, decentralised decision-making, but have a national data system. So the proposal you make, I entirely concur with, yes.
Lady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Mitchell. May I thank everybody for all the efforts they've made to produce their questioning. It's been extremely effective and I'm very grateful. I'm sure Mr Losty will when we come to him. Mr Hancock, that completes the questions that we have for you. Can I just say this? You're not the first, and I'm sure you won't be the last witness to think this inquiry is all about criticising people with the considerable benefit of hindsight and without understanding the pressures that people like you are under. Please, may I assure you that is not my aim. My aim is to investigate what happened, to explore with witnesses matters of public concern and to get people's answers on those areas and to try and come up with recommendations, if I can, that will save lives, something that you were obviously trying to do throughout your time. reduce the human and economic cost of any future pandemic, and maybe reduce the pressure that people like you were under when you had no proper systems in place to respond in an emergency. So please don't take from the questions any kind of predetermined conclusion from me. I am still exploring all different options, and I'm not in the business of criticising with the huge benefits, I say, of hindsight. So thank you for your help. Right, Mr. Losty, who I'm sure will be very grateful to everybody. Losty, I hope you heard that I asked everybody to restrict their questions so we could keep our guarantee to you that you'll make your flight, and they've all been very good at doing that.
I did really appreciate that. Thank you.
Now you've got to hope the airline meets its obligations. Let's go.
My lady, the next witness is Tim Losty.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Take a seat.
Could you please state your full name for the inquiry?
Timothy Gregory Losty.
Thank you. Mr. Losty, you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry for which we're grateful. That's at INQ 000541535 and it's 28 pages, signed on the 12th of February 2025. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
There's one correction I just want to draw your attention to in terms of time. It says that I returned to Belfast after finishing my post in February 2020. It's actually August 2020 when I finished the post in China.
Okay, is that at paragraph 90 of your...
Paragraph 90, yes.
Yes. So that's at the bottom of paragraph 90, notes you left the laptop and iPad in China when you returned to Northern Ireland in February 2020, but that should, where it says February, that should read August.
August,
is that correct? Okay. Is the statement otherwise true to the best of your knowledge?
It is, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Losty, I'm going to go through your rather unique professional background in some detail, but a question at the outset, because you are the first witness that this module of the inquiry is hearing from in relation to Northern Ireland. From 2012 to 2021, you were the Director for International Relations within the Executive Office in Northern Ireland. To what extent is international relations a devolved matter for Northern Ireland?
International relations as an issue and as a sector is an accepted matter, but in recognition that there are international activities that have impact on areas that are devolved to local government, or to the local devolved administrations, they would have responsibility in those areas. So things like economic development, inward investment, attracting students and things like that. So there's an international dimension there. Mm. The Northern Ireland Executive also had particular interests at that time in relationships with the United States. So we had an office in Washington. We had an office in Brussels, given our relationship with the European Union. And then we had the office in Beijing.
And it was while you were the Director of International Relations that you were posted to Beijing as the Director of the Northern Ireland Bureau.
That's correct, yes.
And that was between 2014 until mid-February 2020 when you were evacuated along with a number of other staff.
Yes, I continued in my role as Director for International Relations. I went over to Beijing September 2014 to set up the office. Initially, I was to be there for 6 months.
It was extended to a year, then extended to 2 years, then to 4 years, and I ended up staying there for 6 years. When I was evacuated out in February 2020, it was on a temporary basis, so I still maintained the role of Director of the Northern Ireland Bureau of China and Director for International Relations.
And in addition to those two roles, you also took up an additional role from the 23rd of March to the 16th of June as Acting Principal Private Secretary for the Deputy First Minister.
That's correct. When I returned to Belfast after the evacuation, I volunteered to help out when staff who had underlying health conditions were no longer able to come into work. I volunteered to help out, and I was asked to help out in the Deputy First Minister's office. So that role as PPS, Principal Private Secretary, was as well as my other responsibilities.
Thank you. So throughout the period of time we're going to discuss, you were wearing all three of those hats,
yes.
I believe, and you returned to China on the 17th of June 2020, and it may provide additional context to know that you returned in September 2020 from China, and what role did you take up at that point?
When I returned, I took up the role as Joint Secretary for the North-South Ministerial Council, which is strand 2 of the machinery equipment in Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm. And throughout the period of time that you were working on the procurement that we're here to discuss today, you were aware you were going to take up that role at some point in the future, or you became aware?
I was meant to take up that role in 2018, but because of some problems in getting a replacement for me, I ended up staying in China a bit longer than expected.
Thank you. So it's important to clarify at the outset that you, in any of those three roles, would not usually have any significant role in procurement of healthcare equipment. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And the Executive Office, does it usually have any role in procurement, to your knowledge?
No, the Executive Office wouldn't have a responsibility with regard to procurement. It may have an interest in some issues, but it's not their responsibility. It would normally be the responsibility of the appropriate department and their arm's length bodies, so Department of Finance, and they would have had their procurement body, and Health also had theirs.
And we'll be hearing from witnesses from Department of Finance and Department of Health later on in this module. So in the corporate witness statement of the Executive Office, which has been made by Karen Pearson, I believe you've seen it, we don't need to get up at this point, but she describes the Executive Office and your role as born more from circumstance/opportunity, in that the Executive Office had and still has operational responsibility for the Northern Ireland Bureau in China, and therefore had members of staff who were more knowledgeable with regards to operations in that country and were able to avail of existing contacts. We presume that's a reference to you.
It is, yes.
And would you agree with her characterisation of how you became involved as born more from circumstance/opportunity?
Yes, we didn't have a formal role in procurement as either TEO or as the Northern Ireland Bureau, and I did not have a formal role in procurement, so it was the fact that PPE was required and people were looking for someone who had contacts in China that I got involved in the exercise.
And do you have any background in procurement in your wider career history?
Not in a professional way. My involvement in procurement would have been to work with the responsible procurement bodies in terms of meeting our needs either in a department or in another role in civil service.
And how did you first become aware of the need to source PPE for the health and social care bodies in Northern Ireland?
Well, at that time, mid to late March, I still would have been going into the office, and I would have had meetings with people. I was aware from discussions around the office that there were concerns about sourcing PPE. It was also a major issue for frontline staff, and the media picked it up, so we were all aware that PPE was becoming a big issue.
And how were you identified as being someone who could be involved in the procurement of PPE?
I suppose describing it as at that time, there's a recognition by the ministers and senior officials we needed to get PPE into Northern Ireland. There were concerns about the traditional supply routes. It was identified that China was a possible source. And I suppose, the paraphrase the question went out, do we know anybody with contacts in China who could maybe help us? I was aware of those discussions, and I met with people and said, let me see if I can help.
And in those discussions, did you discuss any other official within the Department of Health, the Department of Finance, or anywhere else who had similar level of contact or insight into procurement in China?
I don't believe any other senior official at that time would have had the knowledge or the contacts in China.
Thank you. So, turning to the point where you become involved, I believe you contacted colleagues in the British Embassy around the 23rd of March, 24th of March. And I want to get up a document that you've provided to the inquiry, INQ 000505603. If we can look at the bottom of that document at page 2. Sorry, at page 2, the bottom of page 2. Thank you. So this is an email that you sent to John Edwards at the FCO, as it was then. And you ask him whether the devolved administrations are to receive an allocation of supplies that the embassy has secured of PPE equipment. And you also say that you'd be grateful for contact information for any suppliers that they have. So at this point, you're scoping out what the situation is in China in regards to general UK government procurement, and also looking for suppliers. And his reply, John Edwards' reply is just above on page 1. Thank you. And he draws your attention to the ministerial implementation groups, specifically the healthcare ministerial implementation group, which he says should be speaking to your colleagues in the DAs directly, but this may not yet be happening. Was this the first that you had heard of the existence of this body?
Yes, it is. As you say, at that time I was trying to scope out or trying to find out more information as to what was happening and help provide some clarity to colleagues. So I contacted people that I knew in the embassy, including John.
Your colleagues in Northern Ireland, did they at that point know what was going on from contact with the UK government?
I'm not sure if they would have had the same information as to what was happening via the embassy in China. So I contacted people that I knew there to get that information, and I passed it back into the system. I suppose at that time there was a lot of information and a lot of uncertainty around a lot of the organisations and departments at the time.
If we can now get up INQ 000505601. This is an update that you provide to some of your colleagues at Department of Finance, Department of Health. We can see you include the Chief Medical Officer, reporting on what Mr. Edwards has said regarding the healthcare ministerial groups. And you also say that you have a list of suppliers in China recommended by contacts there and will send this on. Is that what you describe in your witness statement as the white list?
It is, yes.
And what is the white list?
It was a list of companies that was prepared by the Chinese authorities at the time of companies who would be allowed to export PPE because they were able to meet the necessary quality standards.
So it was a quality assurance point?
Quality and ability, yes.
And did you or anyone else contact any of those companies?
No, I looked through the list of the companies on that list, and I didn't recognise any of them. I spoke with some of my Invest-NI colleagues in China, and they didn't recognise any of them either. I passed the list on to the people who were then involved in procurement of PPE. They may have been aware of the companies at that time, or I thought whenever I sent it on to them, and that wasn't the case, so we weren't aware of anybody on that list.
And so it was on that basis that you decided not to contact any of those companies, and instead contact a company that you were aware of called China Resources. Is that correct?
Yes, so at that time, I didn't know any of the companies on that list. We didn't know anybody else who knew companies on that list. And again, the question that might have went out would have been, can we find somebody over there that knows any of these companies or that can help us? So my role at that time was to try and identify a competent and reliable company who could help us with our PPE needs and persuade them to help us. So I knew one company in China that had been involved in managing hospitals and healthcare. And I contacted them. Initially in my mind, I was contacting them to see if they knew any of those companies and if they could help us with introductions or help us get supplies. So I contacted China Resources, the health people. They said that they got their PPE supplies from China Resources Pharmaceutical. And
was that a subsidiary body of the same company?
Of China Resources, yes. And that they would have worked with a lot of the companies on the list.
So, yes, you say in your witness statement that China Resources Pharmaceutical confirmed that they sourced PPE products from approved manufacturers on the whitelist. So does that mean China Resources Pharmaceutical is essentially a middleman between the Northern Ireland Executive on one hand and a whitelist company on the other?
I'm not sure if middleman would be a fully accurate description, but my information was that they were already sourcing PPE supplies from these manufacturers on a regular basis, not just during the COVID outbreak. I'm not sure whether the companies manufactured solely for China Resources, but I was aware that they were using companies that were on that list.
Okay. It was around about that time that you heard from the Chinese consulate in Belfast that you would require a note verbal or a letter of authorisation in order to procure this PPE. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. These things didn't happen in a linear fashion. You know, all these things were happening at the same time. So to try and identify a competent, credible organisation, going through China Resources to get the introduction, I was also in contact with the consulate in Belfast to get their help, again to see if they knew any of the organisations or companies on the list. I mentioned China Resources. They confirmed that China Resources was a credible company that would have been on the government's list to export. They advised that the best way of moving forward was to provide the company with that note verbal, which is a note from a government body to another organisation or to another government body via another organisation, which basically clarified that we were a government, we were buying the PPE for humanitarian reasons, and it wasn't going to be going to any other organisation.
And do you understand that to be a kind of standard measure, or was this because you were specifically a devolved administration, or was this something out of the ordinary?
I think given my time working with colleagues in the embassies, I think a note verbal would have been a a regular diplomatic tool that was used. We had used it a couple of times in the Northern Ireland Bureau, but this, in the circumstances around COVID and getting an introduction to a company, it's certainly the first time that we were involved in doing something like that.
Okay. You go on to explain in your witness statement that you provided a submission to ministers, both the health minister, the finance minister, and ultimately to the first and deputy first ministers, and that was approved on the 12th of April. I want to go to INQ 000505635 and page 2. This is a query sent on the 11th of April, so the day before the letter was ultimately signed by the First and Deputy First Ministers, and they have two questions, or the First Minister asked two questions. The first is that the consignment will have no detrimental impact on the Northern Ireland share of the UK-wide consignment, and we'll come back to that. And the second, that the contract provides reasonable value for money. And if we can go up to page 1 to see the response. We'll look first at paragraph 2. I appreciate that this email doesn't come from you, Mr. Losty, but it says, given the global demand for PPE and the shortages of supply for some items, it's inevitable that unit prices will be higher. However, given these conditions, the price is reasonable. Appropriate checks and balances have been undertaken in this regard. Were you involved at all in the assessment of value for money?
No, that would have been the procurement professionals who would have been looking at that. And I think in that case it was the body working for the Department for Health.
Thank you. But considering what you've said about the lack of alternative contacts within China, did Northern Ireland have another option than to sign this contract?
I think at that time, given the need for PPE, given the uncertainty about the future, and the fact that we had an option where we could buy the PPE that was needed by the frontline staff to the right quality, that was the only option we had at that time.
Thank you. And looking at paragraph 1, this is response to the query from the First Minister that the consignment will have no detrimental impact on Northern Ireland's share of the UK-wide consignment. The reply notes that DHSC and the Cabinet Office Complex Transaction Team have been supportive of the approach, but that from the next week, the Northern Ireland team in Beijing will be integrated with the British Embassy team, and that will manage the potential conflicts, and that you're going to manage the relationship at a senior level. Prior to the pandemic, what was your understanding of where Northern Ireland got most of its PPE?
Again, it wouldn't have been an area that I would have been involved in at that time, but my understanding from later getting involved in that is that they would have been sourced centrally.
So it would have come from UK government central supply?
I believe so, but the relevant professionals in those bodies will be in a better position to answer.
And we'll address that with them next week. So we have a situation in late March, early April, where Northern Ireland, potentially other devolved administrations, have been relying entirely on UK government supply for their procurement of PPE. That supply is dried up, and now Northern Ireland, including yourself, have gone to carry out a direct procurement with a company that ordinarily you wouldn't have been involved in. And the First Minister, quite reasonably one might say, is concerned that that might have an impact on any allocation of PPE that might later come through the government central supply. So we've seen the email which says that this particular procurement had been supported by DHSC and the Complex Transactions Unit. I want to look now at a letter that came from Chris Wormald, the Permanent Secretary of DHSC at the time. It's dated the 16th of April. It's at INQ 000505641. And you've provided this as part of your witness statement. And if we can look at the bottom two paragraphs, he writes that to enable maximum focus on procurement of supplies to be distributed, the Joint Action Coordination Team, and we heard from witnesses last week that this is basically the team that was in the British Embassy in Beijing, have, on the advice of ministers, advised the overseas network not to undertake additional work to support any new procurement asks, but they stand ready to support any existing orders that have already been placed. And it goes on to say later in the letter that future procurement will be on the basis of a four nations approach. So is the situation at this point that the devolved administrations are being discouraged, or perhaps we can even put it stronger than that, and an embargo is being placed on any future direct procurement by the devolved administrations?
Those discussions would have taken place with the people who normally have been involved in procuring the PPE and working with the UK government on it. My understanding of what I was doing, working with people in the Department of Finance and Department of Health, was to procure PPE to meet that immediate need that we had. And I think there was an understanding amongst people that eventually or hopefully matters would have returned to normal processes. I think the letter, and again, other people will be in a better position to answer more accurately, but I think the letter and us putting our team into the embassy was to make sure that we were coordinating all our work. We weren't competing against each other, and that eventually there would be a kind of a normalisation of the procurement practices.
Thank you. And you go on to say in your witness statement that it was indeed confirmed to central UK government that following completion of that particular order, PPE would be procured on a four nations basis. And we'll discuss that with other witnesses later in this module. Finally, you provide a helpful chronology in your witness statement, which we don't need to bring up, I don't think, but we can see from that that the contract was concluded in mid-May, that the first shipment arrived in June.
Yes.
As an outside observer, one might say, not a procurement professional yourself, do you have insight into why it took a month from your first contact with China Resources on the 3rd of April, or more than a month, for the contract to be concluded, and why it then took a further month for the PPE to be delivered, when I believe it was delivered by air?
I remember being slightly frustrated at the time because of the delay that it was taking, but there was a lot of discussion to make sure that we were getting the right products with the right quality. We also had to look at how best we could get the PPE products back into Northern Ireland and looking at the various logistic routes. So the team that was involved in this procurement exercise at that time, some of us were talking to logistics people from the UK government to see if we could get the PPE onto flights as opposed to trains, which would have taken longer. So we worked through a lot of that. There was also the issue of going through the approval process and then determining how best to manage risk. And I think the ministers in health and finance made the decision to procure the PPE in a number of batches. So there were discussions around that. I think at the end of the day, we got the products from China Resources from their warehouse in Tianjin to Beijing and then back into the UK very, very quickly. And I know there was a It took an extra few days to get from London to Belfast as the various consignments were unloaded and had to be packed up.
I want to turn to two issues that you raise in relation to this procurement. The first is one of media reporting. On the 10th of April, so at a very early stage in your discussions with China Resources, the Stephen Nolan show on the BBC Northern Ireland broadcasted a programme questioning if PPE provided from China met UK standards, and it referenced a memo dated the 6th of April from Sharon Gallagher. It might first be helpful for the inquiry, for those of us who aren't aware, if you explain a little about the tone of the Stephen Nolan show in reporting this event.
Tone in general or tone for that particular?
For this particular procurement.
Okay. Well, PPE and the scarcity of PPE was a big issue of concern for frontline staff, for people who were experiencing COVID, for the families and the politicians. So everybody was concerned about it. The media was also concerned, quite rightly, and I think it was in RF media interest. When this particular show came on and this issue, it was a leaked memo, so we didn't know it was going to be covered. The name of the company we were dealing with was mentioned by one of the people who called into the show, and that wasn't helpful. I think attempts to try and have a balanced discussion around it on the show, you know, where the presenter may have put forward options, you know, well, PPE's needed, we need to get it as quickly as possible. I think there was a balance, but the fact that the memo was leaked, and at that time when we were still in the early stages of negotiation and getting the necessary PPE items confirmed and the right quality standards, it wasn't helpful.
And just to clarify, the memo that was leaked, did it cast any aspersions on the products that were likely to be provided by China Resources?
I don't think that the memo that was leaked cast aspersions, but I think one of the people who rang raised what they considered to be concerns about PPE that were received elsewhere.
So it was simply the fact that Northern Ireland was involved in discussions with a Chinese company for the supply of PPE, and that there had been reports elsewhere in the media that PPE from China was of poor quality. Those two things were linked.
There were issues in the media, across a number of media outlets, about quality of PPE that was coming in. None of those queries related to the company that we were dealing with.
Okay.
PPE was coming in from China in a variety of different ways. The PPE that we got met all the standards. We received some donated PPE from organisations we were in partnership with, as well as expat groups. Some of that PPE, because it didn't come with the necessary quality certification, we were not able to use in frontline services.
But ultimately, the PPE that was provided as a result of this procurement was of good quality and was used.
It all met the necessary standards. That was confirmed by the health professionals and by the ministers, who then confirmed that to China Resources.
Finally, on this point, are you aware of any investigations that were carried out into the source of the leak?
I was told there was an investigation, but I never heard anything from that investigation. I wasn't contacted, and I'm not aware of anything that ever came of it.
Okay, thank you.
Leaking is something about which I have heard before in relation to Northern Ireland, I fear. Shall we break there? Is that a convenient moment?
Yes, of course, my lady.
Very well, I shall return at 20 past. Ms Gardner.
Thank you, my lady. Mr Losty, I just want to turn briefly to the other main risk that you identified in your witness statement that you encountered in the course of the procurement from China Resources Pharmaceutical. You describe various measures that the Department of Health, Department of Finance and the company itself had in place to prevent fraud, due diligence checks, and you've already mentioned the decision to split the order into 2 batches to mitigate any risk. But you say that there were still some clumsy attempts at fraud. The first in April 2020. Could you describe what happened on that occasion?
Yeah, when I say clumsy, it was basically somebody who found out that we were dealing with China Resources sent in an email to say that they were now looking after the order and could we send the money to a different bank account.
Perhaps we could get that email up. It's INQ000505650. Thank you. And if we go to the next page, to page 2, thank you, we can see the email that you describe, asking for a change to contract payment accounts and saying that they've lost the copy of the contract and asking for a copy of that. As you've described, not the most sophisticated attempt, and we can see from later on in that email chain that it was forwarded to within the executive and also then to China Resources, who presumably confirmed that this didn't come from them.
Yes.
The question I have to ask about that is, how would this impersonator have been aware that the negotiations were going on?
I don't know. I suppose in this day and age we're all very familiar with how scammers operate. They can be very clever, so I don't know how people picked up on that information, but I know at that time, with everything else happening in the world, that there were some people up to very unscrupulous activities.
And then the second example that you give was in August. You've mentioned that the order with China Resources was split into 2 parts. And I recognise, Mr Losty, that this is towards the end of your time with the executive, so perhaps your involvement would have been limited at that time. But you say that on that occasion, the impersonation was of the executive, and a contact was made with China Resources trying to confirm the second shipment of gloves, I believe. Is that correct?
I think that second episode was basically contact made with the companies that were working with China Resources to supply us with PPE. Contact was made with one of them to say that this new company was working on behalf of the Northern Ireland Executive and to provide them with the products. And this was a shell company. In other words, it hadn't existed before. It had just been set up in a couple of days before they made that contact. And no names, no company history, nothing.
Okay. But they were aware that the order had been split in 2 and there was going to be some further batch that was going to make its way to Northern Ireland.
I can't say if they were aware the order was split in 2. I think they were aware of an order of gloves that the Northern Ireland Executive was expecting to get from or via China Resources.
And can you say how they could have become aware of that?
Again, I don't know. Could be a variety of ways that these people operate. But again, it was a clumsy attempt. And would never have happened, one, because of China Resources, their practices. Also, we had, at that stage, an exclusivity agreement with China Resources. And also, the shell company wouldn't have been on the China government's list to be able to export PPE.
Was there ever any investigation into whether the source of the leaks we discussed earlier could have also passed on information to these potential fraudsters?
Not that I'm aware of, sorry.
That connection was not made at any point?
No.
Okay. I want to move on to briefly talk about the proposed joint procurement that you mentioned in your statement with the Republic of Ireland. And this was not successful ultimately, but it did receive some media coverage at the time. And I'm aware from your statement that you say you were not involved in the early discussions, and we'll explore that with other witnesses later in this module. But when and how did you become involved in these discussions with the Republic of Ireland?
Around that, well, if I'm right in the area that you're looking at, I was contacted by someone in the Department of Finance who had been talking to colleagues in the counterpart departments in the Irish Republic. And I think the offer had been made that if we procure PPE, potentially we could do it on a joint basis. The question I think I was asked was, if we're going to do something with the South, would I be willing to help? And I said that I would be willing to help. But after that, I think it never went any further. The South had their systems and procedures in operation, and we continued on with ours.
You say in your witness statement that it became apparent very quickly that the Republic of Ireland was doubtful they would be able to receive a supply that would allow some of that to be siphoned off for Northern Ireland.
Sorry, in relation to that, my contact then was in the early stages when we were trying to find out if we could source PPE. There have been discussions with the Minister of Finance, with the Irish government, and there was hope that they would have been able to meet the PPE needs in the Northern Ireland Executive. I suppose there was some uncertainty started to develop. Because I was hoping to go to the North-South Ministerial Council, I would have been in contact with the other Joint Secretary there, had the opportunity of a telephone call, and we discussed the matter. And I was made aware that there were concerns within their system whether they would be able to secure enough PPE that would have helped us out. I became aware that they were trying to source them via China. I worked very well and very closely with the Irish Embassy in Beijing, and I said, well, look, I'll try and contact the embassy and see what they say. So I was in contact with the ambassador at the time. We set up a Zoom or a Skype call, and they confirmed to me that they have been talking to PPE suppliers, and that they had basically exhausted all the amount that they were able to get at that time. They had met the quota, or if they'd been given the quota, they couldn't go beyond that. And
I'm asking you this question partly with your hat on as Joint Secretary of the, as you were later. But do you think that there were opportunities that were missed in terms of collaboration with the Republic of Ireland over procurement?
If I go back to that time, I don't think there were opportunities missed. When I spoke to both the Joint Secretary and people in the embassy in Beijing, the agreement was, look, you know, we keep the communications going. If we can identify areas where we can help the Northern Ireland Executive, we will. And also, if there's issues that the Northern Ireland Executive has, or if I had, to contact them and see if they could help. Various times there was talk about maybe trying to get PPE products back using their logistics chain, possible introductions, things like that. But by that stage, we'd already initiated the negotiations with China Resources.
Okay. I want to look finally at two recommendations or lessons learned that you highlight in your witness statement. The first is at paragraph 104 of your witness statement. Thank you. You highlight the variety of organisations that were involved here, 9 departments, each headed by a permanent secretary, reporting to ministers from 5 different parties, as is the nature of the Northern Ireland Executive.
Yeah.
You say that this worked well because the 2 ministers agreed on the priority of securing PPE and the officials worked well. But you do also say the operation of senior officials within departmental silos did not always facilitate the cooperation required to face a crisis, and highlighted the weakness of the chain of command between the head of the civil service and permanent secretaries. You note that the head of civil service does not have an accounting officer role and the permanent secretaries each report to a different minister. Can you just expand or perhaps give us an example of what you mean by that cooperation or lack of cooperation highlighting the weakness of the chain of command?
I don't think it was an unwillingness to cooperate, but given the chain of the command, senior officials and permanent secretaries would first of all have to go to their minister to agree on lines to take or actions that might be taken, and then they would come together. So the system of government works for us, and it's been successful. But in some issues where I suppose decisions need to be taken very quickly and problems solved very quickly, there was this additional layer of approval and authority to go through. And also, the reality of the situation is you had political parties with different ideological perspectives on some issues, and sometimes they may have been factored in.
So were there occasions where you felt that decisions weren't made as quickly as perhaps they ought to have been because of political differences between the ministers leading the respective departments?
I think any political differences may have already been discussed by previous witnesses. I wouldn't be aware of an issue that was stopped because of political differences. There was a lot of reporting and also things going on at the time. The officials operated or tried to operate in a non-political environment to get things done. But when you have the reporting structures that you have to work through those. As I say, it was an additional layer of people who had to be persuaded to do things.
Okay. And if we can just go to paragraph 106 on the same page. You note that on a number of occasions you also felt the UK government came across as disinterested in working with or hearing the concerns of the devolved administrations, and this was sometimes reflected in the attitudes of some UK officials. Do you have an example of where you got that impression?
First of all, when I was acting PPS for the Deputy First Minister, I would have either sat in on calls with the 4 nations, with UK government ministers, or I would have been party to or listened in. And I felt at the time it was kind of, the call came in, Scottish government would go, Welsh government would go, Northern Irish government would go, say their concerns, and at the end it would have been, well, thanks very much, we'll arrange a call next week. And I felt some of the issues were more deserving of discussion and debate. So that's very much a personal reflection of mine at the time. In relation to working with officials from the UK government, first of all, I would pay respects to the people in the UK government who did help us and the people that I talked to on a personal basis that helped. But I was frustrated that I never really got to talk to senior decision makers, perhaps people more at my grade within the embassy network, where when you're talking to the decision makers, you can be talking about the problems, you can be talking about the possible solutions, you can find out more about what is happening in terms of instructions or policy or practice and things like that. And I felt a bit of frustration at times when we were trying to work through the early days of getting this sorted.
Thank you. Do you think that that was an impression that was generally shared by your colleagues?
I don't think I'm the only one with that perspective. And also, I think it may be shared in other devolved administrations.
Thank you. That was all my questions for Mr. Losty.
Thank you. Just a few more questions from Mr. Wilcock, who may be trying to get the same flight. I don't know.
Mr. Losty, I'm asking you questions on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families for Justice campaign. And my questions are just going to cover your role in relation to the Northern Ireland procurement exercise with China Resources Pharmaceutical, and also a few questions in relation to the failed North-South attempt to buy PPE from China in March 2020. So you'll probably maximise your chances of getting your plane, which I can guarantee you will do in any event, but you'll maximise those if you answer as many of the questions as I ask you, yes or no. And let's start in this way. You've told us about the circumstances in which you got in contact with China Resources Pharmaceutical Limited and how that was a mixture of circumstances and opportunity. Had you experience of working with China Resources Pharmaceutical Limited prior to Northern Ireland's post-COVID procurement exercise with them?
No, and if you don't mind, I'll expand on that.
Yeah.
I had experience of working with the China Resources Organisation across a number of their sectors, in agriculture and in trade and market access, and then also with their health division where they were managing hospitals. So I was familiar with the company there, and I'd met the company on many representatives of the corporation at many events involved in through my role in economic diplomacy.
And to be clear, you make clear in your statement that you'd had experience of working with them, but you didn't have any personal business interest in either the resources or the pharmaceutical company. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Now, you also made it clear in your statement that you declared your prior working with the China Resources Corporation in verbal briefings with the head of the civil service, the First Minister, and the Minister of Finance after you made first contact. Did you, in doing so, make clear the link between the China Resources Corporation you did have prior contact with and the China Resources Pharmaceutical Limited, who were to become the main, I think the word was used, go-between in relation to the procurement exercise?
My recollection would be that I know a company in China. I've had dealings with them in the past. I know they're involved in this sector. I think they can help us. So I would have made the politicians and the senior officials aware of how I knew the company.
But would you have made them aware of the link between the company you were disclosing a past link to and the company that Northern Ireland was about to try and deal with?
I think that I would have declared that after after my initial contact with the organisation, where I contacted the people that I knew, and they said, we don't provide this, but one of our other family companies, they provide it. So I would have said to senior officials that we were going to get an introduction to this other part of the organisation.
Thank you. Different topic. I'm right, am I not, that the inquiry doesn't have any of the phone messages or emails from any of the devices that you were using at the time of your dealings with China Resources Pharmaceuticals?
I believe it has emails. The majority of in fact, all the negotiations with China Resources were conducted by the procurement professionals in finance and health. My job was as the facilitator and advisor on doing business with the Chinese company. Emails that I had from that time, I kept, and they were provided to our TEO inquiry team before I retired. I did have a very frustrating experience in that the phone that I was using to communicate with my colleagues in China and also China Resources, that broke around the 20th of April. It caused me a lot of problems because we were at a very important stage of the negotiation, so I had to get reconnected back onto the WeChat platform to maintain the communications. So it was a frustrating and difficult time, so there are no WeChat messages from that early period up until about the 21st, 22nd of April.
I think in relation to the emails, we do, and we saw one when you were asking questions with Ms Gardner, we do have some of the emails that you were sent, but we don't have them for your email account, do we? We have them from other parties to the exchanges. Am I wrong about that?
My email account at that time was not a Northern Ireland Civil Service email account, it was a standalone account that was set up for me. When I came back to Belfast, I still had access to that account, and knowing that I was retiring and knowing also that we needed to provide relevant documents to the inquiry, our internal inquiry team, I then made those available.
And can I make it clear, I'm not suggesting there's anything suspicious in the fact your phone was broken and someone else cleared the emails. My question is really this: did it not occur to you to ensure that all of your communications on your phone and your email accounts were backed up and would therefore be available should those devices be broken or closed down, as happened?
First of all, with the emails, it was my understanding that they were still available after I retired, and I was still able to access that email account. It was deleted without contacting me, and I wasn't aware of it until we started to get involved in this. The backup of the WeChat messages, and I know people back up onto this thing, the cloud and all the rest of it. I didn't get around to doing that because the phone I was using at that time was my personal phone, which I had purchased on the understanding that I was coming back to Belfast at that time and that I wasn't going to have my period in China extended. It was, so I continued to use that phone. It broke. If I had had that phone in working order, those messages would have been backed up. But I would want to assure any of the people who were involved in the frontline services, any of the relatives of people who were victims of COVID and anybody else, certainly there was nothing untoward or irregular.
And I want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting there was.
Yeah. The messages also in WeChat tended to be more administrative, and I think we've provided examples of, or not examples, we provided all those messages post 22nd of April, but all those messages, or the majority of those messages would be admin type messages following up on meetings that we would have had or trying to arrange times for Zoom calls or WeChat calls, things like that. So I don't believe there would have been anything in those earlier messages that we're missing information on.
Do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, in an ideal world, it would have been better to have backed up both those devices?
It would have been better to have backed up the phone, but it wasn't my intention that it broke at the time. In hindsight, also, I would have preferred not to have had to use my own phone, but I was in a peculiar situation where I thought I was returning home, and sitting in the airport, I get a call to say, no, we need you to stay on for a while.
And just for the benefit of those listening who don't know, WeChat is the Chinese equivalent of WhatsApp, is that right?
WhatsApp, Facebook, all those things, yes.
Last topic, the joint procurement exercise with the Irish government. In your statement, and if you have it in front of you, you don't need it, but if you do have it in front of you, it's at paragraph 82. You describe your brief involvement in the proposed joint procurement in late March, and you describe a Zoom call at that time with the Irish Embassy, including the ambassador. And you say it was explained to you that they had utilised all of their resources in terms of the PPE supplies, and that due to the international demand, they were unable to add any more to their allocation at that time. Now, one interpretation of this explanation was that by the time the Northern Ireland Executive approached Dublin, the Irish government had already agreed a quota that they couldn't then go beyond to bring the North into their approaches. Is that interpretation correct?
I don't think I can fully answer that question. I think that's something the Irish government could answer. In my role, and because I knew people, I was trying to find out what the situation was. And it was described to me in that meeting, you know, we've got everything that we're going to get. I don't think there was maybe a quota negotiated at the start, but it was an extremely competitive and challenging environment, and it was certainly a seller's market. And the view from those officials was we're getting everything we're going to get. Now, it wasn't their decision as to whether or not the South would be able to help. That would have been taken at a senior level and a political level. But I was able to get from that information that, you know, from my view, it was unlikely that this was going to happen.
Did you get any impression as to whether the reason the exercise didn't succeed was not because of any fundamental obstacle with the two governments putting in a joint bid, but because the Northern Ireland Executive hadn't contacted the Irish authorities early enough?
I don't know if I can fully answer that. I don't think it was a matter of timing. And again, you know, when we're looking back at these things, it looks like everything was happening in a linear way. All these things that were happening at the same time. And information on what was happening on the PPE procurement market, we were getting that on a live basis. So I don't think I would say that the problem was the timing of the request going in, because we now know, you know, there's still discussions with the UK Four Nations network, and hopefully that would have been able to provide. And I think at that time we were looking at all options. We knew there was pressure, the frontline staff, we knew there was pressure there, and the executive, the ministers and the officials all wanted to try and get the stuff in as quickly as possible.
And just so everyone knows, we're now talking about late March by the time of this joint approach between the two governments.
When I would have been, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ma'am, there are all the questions I have to ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilcock. That completes all the questions that we have for you. Thank you very much for your help to the inquiry, and safe journey back to Belfast.
Thank you, my lady.
Very well. Tomorrow I should be sitting at 10, but as everyone here knows, I will be in closed session at least until the afternoon, where I think there's part of a witness who can be heard in open, but otherwise closed for tomorrow morning. Thank you.